Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. Here you'll find the best cybersecurity tips for 2026 and learn how you can stay safe online. And in today's video, I want to talk to you about how ransomware can spread within a company, and that ransomware now affects not only businesses, but also many private individuals. So ransomware is absolutely on trend for 2026. And as I said, it also affects many people working from home, private individuals who trade Bitcoins. And yes, those people, anyone who has valuable information, maybe even whistleblowers, so to speak. But primarily, of course, it affects people who might also be interesting targets in their private lives. And this is, of course, an interesting example here with the LastPass hack, where several cryptocurrencies or vaults were targeted for cracking, which then also contained Bitcoin keys. I'm not really that familiar with it myself when it comes to Bitcoin. But of course, there was definitely valuable information in there, valuable passwords, valuable phrases that enabled access to these Bitcoins. And in total, several million Bitcoins were stolen through this LastPass hack. Exactly. That's also why hackers don't just say, I'm going to pick out some private individual or some random company. They do have an idea of who might be lucrative, that's for sure, yes. But they don't say, okay, I want to hack this or that company, or wow, this person has just come into a Bitcoin fortune. I don't think that's actually how it works. It works differently there. In any case, it's true that certain companies are more lucrative than private individuals. That's just how it is with ransomware. I've personally been affected by malware myself. When I was 14, for the first time, I got a worm or a virus on my computer. Someone wrote to me, okay, your PC is now broken. You can try using it. I installed malware on it. Of course, that was completely intentional, obviously. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I downloaded a fake version of a program again, but it wasn't that bad. I was able to fix it myself by reinstalling Windows 11. And it wasn't a big deal. The PC was just a bit slower. But fortunately, I've never been affected by ransomware or major virus or phishing attacks because I've developed a good sense of cybersecurity and can recognize those phishing emails. We really need to clearly distinguish here between phishing emails, viruses, worms, trojans, and ransomware. As I just mentioned, with viruses and also with worms, the main goal is to damage or destroy this nice machine, the PC here. The reasons are usually revenge. Revenge, or simply because a lot of people enjoy it. In most cases, it's not about money or anything like that. It's simply about the motive that someone wants to do it just because they want to, because it makes them feel good, or because they want to get revenge on someone. Of course, the damage is just as great nonetheless. And with phishing emails, it's obviously about stealing passwords and data. This can also, for example, later be useful for a ransomware attack. But here, the primary goal is first to steal passwords and data, and then perhaps also to spy on the company or the individual. Of course, all of this falls under the term malware, clearly. And it all has this goal, a single goal, to harm the person or the company. And how does ransomware even get onto the computer, and what role do antivirus software and their manufacturers play? Antivirus software and antivirus manufacturers, protection software in this context, specifically Windows Defender. And of course, major programs like Kaspersky and Bitdefender, I've already made videos about this. They rely on a database of viruses they know, meaning known viruses from the past. Sorry. Yes, they cross-check with each other and see, okay, we've seen this before, it goes into quarantine, we won't allow it at all, and that's how you stay safe. That works pretty well, because this antivirus protection software draws on years of experience, especially Kaspersky, and in fact, most viruses. At that time, were also already known. But the fact is, new viruses keep coming out, new worms and other malware keep appearing, so antivirus software manufacturers are always playing catch-up, so to speak. They really are working hard on it, and a lot is happening quickly, and as I said, there really is good software on the market. But there is also a lot of new malware that simply isn't known yet, which they can't compare with their databases. And then there's always this point of criticism. Snake software, snake oil, well, it's not called snake oil, but snake software, snake oil, because people say it doesn't do any good. You give away all your data, you allow access to your computer, just so, for example, BTFN can monitor everything. And it's true, that's how it is. Yes, just to fend off this potential Trojan or this potential worm or whatever it might be. Yes, that's simply a fact. And the advantage is Windows Defender is built right into Windows 11 or Windows 10. You just have to install it. That's always the argument from the other side, which I think is complete nonsense from my point of view, because everything has its right to exist. And Kaspersky as well as Bitdefender have been on the market for quite some time. And they know what they're doing. But again, and I say this because this software simply cannot detect all viruses and not all Trojans either. And that brings us to the point of how this actually happens. So let's suppose we're in a company and a secretary clicks on an invoice or a job application. That was a case in Switzerland. I think in that instance, it was actually a job application. And the woman didn't suspect anything. She clicked on it and thought, well, it's just a job application, so I'll open it, download it. It was, I believe, a PDF file. In any case, it was an attachment, which she opened. And in this case, I think this attachment didn't even have the goal of spreading ransomware, but rather to paralyze the computers, to bring down the IT systems. It worked extremely well. It was a city administration that was offline for several days and had to do everything by hand. But in principle, it's exactly the same thing. These sophisticated hacker groups, much like the Conti organization in the past, actually operate just like a professional business. So at the very top of the hierarchy, there is always a CEO or a primary boss, a position that manages everything with several teams. You can actually imagine it more like a pyramid structure, like in network marketing, with multiple teams working together, and at the very top, the main team. It's all very organized. It's organized cybercrime, yes, absolutely, which is sold over the darknet. You can imagine it like this. Actual tenders or job postings are created there. Yes, for example, we can help you hack this or that company, and whoever is interested then gets in touch with this group, with this hacker group, for instance. Of course, everything is done anonymously and via StarCraft, obviously. So not like I just described, where you would just call them up and, like a phone service or something like that. No, it really all happens very anonymously and in the dark, you could say, so that many people don't even notice it at all. All right, back to this email. When this attachment is opened, of course, malware is unpacked, usually. And of course, you first have to gain access to the laptop in order to encrypt the data. That's the goal of the attackers in this case. They have then successfully achieved that, and they can then encrypt the data accordingly. And now the crucial thing is how companies and also private individuals respond. Ideally, by not paying, and more people need to be told not to pay because it doesn't help. I've watched several documentaries, and they actually showed that hacker groups are not always willing to decrypt the data again, and it can be very time-consuming. If we stick with a medium-sized company, for example, that has had several million files encrypted, decrypting all of them again is, of course, also very time-consuming. Yes, it might be financially worthwhile if the hacker group demands $2 million, but most companies don't pay that. And I think that, fortunately, many are actually able to fall back on backups here. That's the good thing. And that's why it's so important to create regular backups so that you are simply up to date. Recently, I read in CT magazine about a company that couldn't directly fall back on backups, but was able to restore everything through close cooperation with an IT forensics expert. And this ransomware means ransom after all, could thus be avoided. Yes, so the most common method hackers use to actually gain access to a laptop is, of course, through phishing emails or similar means. Not just through email attachments or email links, but also through browser security vulnerabilities and in general through backdoors. That's actually the main point of entry, I would say, backdoors. I even wrote a book called Behind the Backdoor, and it doesn't necessarily have to happen only online. For example, it can also happen offline. I recently wrote a story about this, about a woman who worked at a company, picked up a USB stick and plugged it in because it said, "Our last meeting from the business conference." And what happens then? You get curious. Okay, maybe someone lost their stick. I want to see what's on it and give it a try. Yes, unfortunately, there are employees and maybe just people in general who say, I absolutely want to know what's on there. I want to try it out. And of course, that's one possibility. Or even within the company itself, someone could carry out these things. That's rather unlikely, though. But it could also, for example, come from a supplier or someone like that. Still, it's a possibility that potentially exists, definitely. But it's actually becoming less and less likely that it would happen through other companies. And it's also very unlikely that hackers, like in those movies, would go into a bank, knock pens off the table, and then secretly smuggle in a USB stick, plug it into a computer, and bring down the entire IT system that way. So that's really just something you see in movies, I'd say. In reality, it's actually more the case that employees open these email attachments, download malware, and hackers can gain remote access to that computer. And then they can take full control of that computer and also encrypt data. That's just how it is. They then gain access to the entire hard drive and can even encrypt the whole hard drive. What can you do if you're affected? And how should you generally behave when it comes to ransomware? The most important thing is really to stay calm and try to find a solution, absolutely. And the solution, first and foremost, is not to pay. Of course, you can try to cooperate with the hackers, with this hacker group, and attempt to decrypt the data. But as I said, that's usually expensive and time-consuming. And the better option is to internally consider what you can do to regain access to your data. And of course, in the future, avoid such incidents and ideally upgrade your IT so that these hackers can be excluded if they're still in the network. That was the case with the Bundestag, which was hacked in 2016 or 2017. Unfortunately, it's a serious problem here in Germany that the hackers were able to interact within the network for a very long time. And it was a similar case there where they were able to get this ransomware through more or less because the secretary also clicked on an attachment. And it was simply the point of entry, that one computer, which then more or less gave access to all computers, all hard drives. In other words, that single point that had access to everything and was then able to work its way through the entire network, the entire IT system. And they really had to start from the ground up to clean everything and completely rebuild the IT system. Unfortunately, Germany is a very bad example in this regard. Or, well, what does bad example mean? They're probably better prepared by now. But many companies in Germany still tend to think, well, you don't really need it, it'll be fine somehow. Unfortunately, that's the mindset here. But back to the topic. So, what can you do if you are affected? And if this ransomware is already in full swing? The best option, of course, is to restore everything yourself by using your backups. And then you can more or less ignore the hacker group, so to speak, and be on the safe side. That's the best way to avoid the whole thing. And afterwards, you can really only say that you could upgrade your IT or provide more intensive training for employees. Whether you do this beforehand or afterwards doesn't really matter. The crucial thing is always to stay up to date, to know what ransomware is and what you should avoid doing, what you shouldn't click on, what you shouldn't open. Yes, I know it's getting harder and harder to recognize, especially with phishing emails, but also in general with AI-generated texts. And unfortunately, also with people who pretend to be someone else, so to speak. In business, it might be even worse than in private life, for example, when someone pretends to be the boss, who then says, transfer the 10,000 euros. And in reality, it's actually someone completely different who sent that email. And that's why it's really important to communicate well internally, to know exactly, was that really the case? The employees need to keep an eye out for this and check carefully. Could that really be the address? In the email, that is, look at the address line. Who is the email from? What does it say inside? Is it the way we usually communicate? Does anything sound strange? Yes, really pay attention to that. And as the name suggests, ransomware, unfortunately, is extortion and ransom. There are numerous cases, even recent ones from last year and this year, where hackers have actually hacked several hundred companies here in Germany. In the Stuttgart area, and they were successful because these companies simply did not have a good cybersecurity strategy. What do I do about that? By that, I mean simply having poor antivirus protection, I would say. Windows Defender isn't that great, but many people just say, yeah, that's fine, Windows Defender is installed, and they haven't even installed the enterprise or business version. And then with WannaCry, that was the problem, and it still is the problem. I just wrote an article about this, that many people still have Windows 10 and need to upgrade all their computers to be up to date with Windows 11. Exactly, that's something that always poses a potential risk. And now, of course, there's also the new risk posed by AI, that with artificial intelligence, yes, with AI, there can be more and more problems. That's one aspect, and on the other hand, artificial intelligence is now so advanced that it can also be used to discover security vulnerabilities in browsers. Cloud Code discovered over 50 security vulnerabilities in Chrome alone, just 2 weeks ago, I believe, which were then able to be fixed relatively quickly. So here again, it's a matter of light and shadow, as I like to say, that AI can be used to analyze one's own vulnerabilities. I'm not saying that we should replace cybersecurity consultants or IT forensic experts, but rather use AI to check and analyze certain vulnerabilities and make sensible use of it. On the other hand, artificial intelligence, well, it also depends, of course, on how much it's used within a company and whether you work a lot with tools like Comet. If you work with Comet or with publicity and so on, I can't say that this is generally a cybersecurity risk if, as an entrepreneur, I don't use these tools. But the fact is, hacker groups are using AI for AI-generated texts, for AI-generated phishing emails, and probably in the future for other forms of ransomware or cyber attacks as well. And the best thing you can actually do is to inform yourself in advance, to be informed, train your employees, continue to educate yourself regularly, and stay up to date. And yes, if you act afterwards, it's exactly the same. I might be repeating myself a bit here. That's just how it is. You should pay attention to this. Yes, that's it. How ransomware can get onto a computer. By now, it's probably already well known that, as mentioned, it usually happens through emails and email attachments. But I still wanted to address it again because recently I've written a lot about it, many stories, and I've spent a lot of time dealing with the topic. This is actually the #1 main topic in cybersecurity. One of the most common things that happens, as I said, now not only to companies, but also to private individuals, because it's simply more lucrative than just putting a virus on a device. I actually don't hear it much anymore like I used to, that people say you have to watch out for a virus on your laptop. That's become very, very rare. And worms and Trojans, yes, of course, those still exist here and there. But in the media, you mostly hear about phishing emails and ransomware, because those are the kinds of attacks that are really lucrative. If I have a password and access to someone's account, I can actually do something with it. For example, empty out an account or log into some big company. Of course, that's potentially more interesting than destroying 100 laptops. And with ransomware, it's obviously primarily about ransom money, that's clear. But if you know how to protect yourself and what the critical points of entry are, then you're definitely a bit safer already. Thank you very much for your attention.